They said the house slept with coins of light under its tongue. Tonight the lanterns counted them as if keeping watch. Snow had laid itself in a soft, indifferent layer across the eaves, each flake resting like a small promise. From the bathhouse, steam rose in broad, unhurried plumes that the innkeeper called the dragon's breath. Not because there was a beast beneath the floorboards, but because the warmth held the same slow patience as an old thing breathing in its sleep. Inside, the inn's rooms were braided with these quiet riches. Lantern glow pooled on the threshold like scattered pennies. The thin paper of sliding screens folded into pale, scale-like sheets, and the wooden beams, sanded and oiled for generations, held the faint, dark rings of hands who had tended them before. The innkeeper moved as if she, too, were part of the hoard. She was neither youthful nor practiced to a degree that made skill private. Rather, her hands carried their competence plainly. A steady thumb that smoothed washi. A palm that knew where to set a steaming kettle so the table would not tremble. Her name was Etta. She had the slow composure of someone who had spent years learning how warmth settles, and where draught might find a seam. When she lit the lanterns, she did not place them by chance. She set them as a seamstress sets stitches, a measured spacing, an eye to how one small light would meet its neighbor, and together keep the dark at bay. She found the first breach as she was turning a Noren aside. A short curtain that hung across the bath's timber threshold, dyed a deep indigo and patched twice over with honest, square mends. A thin tear had opened along an old seam, the threads fraying like tiny fingers. It was not dramatic. It was a modest complaint, the sort of thing that always calls for attention, not spectacle. The bathhouse's outer rail, too, when she drew the sliding door, gave a soft, clarifying groan, and a slight rattle suggested that one of the runners had loosened. The house, she thought, had spoken in whisper. "Mend me." She folded the Noren with the reverence one might give a parcel of letters. In the light, its patched squares looked like coins with worn faces. Etta set the curtain on the low counter where the kettle steamed, and listened to how the house settled around the problem. The creak of floorboards, the settling hiss of steam, the cat padding along the veranda as if to inspect. The cat, Bramble, had fur that married gray and russet, and he regarded Etta from where he had chosen a warm spot by the hearth, tail curled round like a small, deliberate comma. He had the solemnity of a creature accustomed to domestic economies, to who slept, who rose, where crumbs might be found. A small tear can call a village together. Etta stepped outside, pulling the collar of her coat up against the cold. Lantern light made the snow look mottled with gold. Neighbors were needed for this work because mending was not merely practical, it was an ethical posture. Visible repair, Etta believed, showed respect for what one had. It did not hide loss. It embroidered it into the life of the house. She moved along the path beneath the eaves, breath clouding, and knocked at the carpenter's door. The carpenter, Hadley, opened with his sleeves dusted in fine shavings, as if the act of working itself trailed him. He was a quiet man, with broad palms and a method to how he placed tools down. Never by accident, always by use. He kept his plane in a small cloth, the wood's grain echoing stories of timber felled months earlier, and thought through by hands like his. The apprentices came with him, not as apprentices to be disciplined, but as companions in craft. Mira, whose fingers already knew the temper of thread, and Jory, who had only recently understood how a mallet's weight could be coaxed into a softer rhythm. From the lane came the elder Mrs. Arbuthnot, walking with a cane that had been smoothed by years. She moved slowly, but with deliberate purpose. Where others might speak of mending as a technical process, she spoke of it as a matter of memory, visible seams that told stories rather than hid them. The gardener, Asha, arrived with a basket of moss and coarse twine. She carried the outdoors in her hands, soil veined under the nails. She offered greenery not as ornament, but as material. Moss, she said, would cushion and dampen and bind. Inside the inn, light pooled on low tables. There was no urgency to the gathering. Every entry was greeted as if returning home. A kettle was set on the brazier, its mouth sighing into the room, and the sound became part of how the house declared itself as hospitable. The items they gathered for the evening read like a small inventory of a life well kept. A reel of waxed thread, its surface slightly tacky from use. A spool of twine, rough and honest. A sheet of washi stored in a shallow wooden box. A narrow strip of oak that had been planed and set aside months prior, waiting for a purpose. Brass grommets kept in a tin that rattled like faint, metallic laughter when turned. The tools were not plentiful, but they were precise. A plane whose blade had been honed until it spoke softly through oak. A mallet with a head dulled by years of work. An awl that seemed to find the grain's correct path almost before one decided where to make a hole. They sat together in the warm glow, the lantern light dulling the world to the edges. Etta, the innkeeper, placed the torn Norn on the table between them. Up close, the tier looked more like an old map folded back upon itself. The threads were frayed in a way that revealed both the curtain's usage and its endurance. Hadley set his plane aside and studied the piece as if measuring not only fabric, but story. "Visible mending," he said, in that steady voice that one could imagine applied equally to a doorframe or to a person's habits, "is like the way we read a face. We see where it has been cared for." Mira unwrapped the spool of waxed thread with the kind of care one gives to a small, preferred thing. She drew the thread between her fingers, and the wax caught in the light like a thin film of gold. Jory watched with the earnestness of someone hungry for a pattern. The elder, sitting back, watched the apprentices more than the cloth. For her, these hands were the continuation of something older than any single seam. The first tasks were small and deliberate. They trimmed ragged edges with a neat pair of scissors until the fray would not catch again. Then, in a manner that passed from older hand to younger, they prepared a backing of washi, thin, translucent, and strong, to paste behind the Norn's tier. There is a certain alchemy to glue and paper. Once pasted, the washi took on the texture of skin and made the whole more resilient. The act of pasting was not hurried. Etta measured by eye and touch, smoothing the paste in long, patient strokes so the paper lay without bubbles, as though sliding a small boat into calm harbor. Hadley spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words were practical aphorisms that watched the apprentices as closely as they watched him. "Plane with the grain until the grain gives way," he said, setting an example by running his plane over a spare strip of oak until its shed curls the color of candle wax. "Don't strip what patience has bound together. Listen to the wood." He held the plane low, shoulder steady, the motion precise. Jory tried, and the plane snagged it first, then found purchase in the grain, and the oak let go of a thin curl of wood that caught the lantern light and seemed to shine as if it were never wood but a thing that had been gilded. The house took these sounds, plain size, mallet quiet, into its sleep. Bramble wound between the apprentice's feet, and made that particular purring noise that is equal parts contentment and instruction. The apprentices learned by imitation, where to rest the palm so the needle would not wobble, how to hold the thimble so as not to bruise the fingertip, the particular cadence with which one drew thread through fabric so the stitch would look like a small, confident footprint. There was an older economy to the way they chose materials. Asha's moss offered not decoration, but form. She made small pads to sit beneath the new grommets so that when the curtain swung, the brass would not rub raw the grain of its rod. The elder, with her cane across her knees, told one of those compact stories that were neither long nor trivial. Once, she said, there had been a traveler who mended his coat with patches made from other coats. Each patch held a tale. People could read a man's life by the diversity of his mends. The apprentices listened as if the story were a map. Work settled into a rhythm of small, punctuated acts. The plane's blade sang. The mallet tapped a measured code. There was a sequence: measure, mark, plane, test, fit. They selected a length of oak for the bath rail, something seasoned, not too thick, cut last summer and held in the workshop's dry corner. Hadley taught them to feel for the twist in a board, to know when it would resist and how to coax it into place with a scarf joint, rather than forcing a single stubborn piece. Mira learned to plane with both forearm and attention. Jory learned to test a fit with his shoulder rather than his hands, letting his whole posture be the gauge. Meals were simple and purposeful. Someone brought out small bowls of soup flavored with miso and root vegetables. Bread, warm from the oven, was broken and given as if sharing were part of a mending ritual. Conversation was not for the purpose of idle speech. Each remark bent gently toward the work. Mrs. Arbuthnot told them how her mother had patched a child's jumper with bright squares. So the boy never lost his way when he ran. Asha described how moss could be layered to make a door jamb, breathe less against damp weather. Etta moved between them, pouring tea and listening, folding and refolding cloth, the way a seamstress might keep an eye on the hem while threading a needle. The mending montage lengthened into the evening. They cut and spliced and sewed. They pasted and measured. They set grommets and fussed the final edge. The house accepted each repair like a patient host receiving small offerings. Each stitch that showed on the Norn's surface was praised not for its invisibility, but for its honesty. They allowed the join to be visible, a deliberate line that would say, "We cared enough to repair, and we did not attempt to pretend nothing had been required." As the repairs progressed, the house seemed to breathe more evenly. Steam no longer hammered the windows with condensation. Instead, it wandered into the rafters and pooled in lazy curls. The lanterns made little coins on the tatami mats. The plane's shavings lay together in a pale pile like fallen scales, thin and almost metallic in the light. The innkeeper looked at them and smiled, for the image was proper. A domestic hoard of small, exact things. Shavings of timber, threads of wax, the warmed brass of grommets. If this quiet evening suits you, a quiet follow helps us share more nights like this. The night thickened outside the panes. Footsteps on the path slowed and ceased. The world beyond the inn narrowed to the sound of a distant wheel and the soft, habitual noises within. They were midway through fitting the new rail, when a sound at the outer gate divided the room's attention. Not a shout, not an urgent knock, but a slow, careful tapping, as if someone tested the world before entering it. The tap was polite. It asked permission. Etta opened the gate herself. A figure stood framed by snow and lamplight, wrapped against the cold, shoulders bent with the travel of many roads, a parcel bound in oilcloth held close to the chest. Their face was not young, nor old, but a middle distance, eyes that had the pragmatic steadiness of someone used to carrying things forward. They hesitated for a breath, and then gave a bow, small and respectful, a way of asking hospitality rather than demanding it. "A place to warm," the traveler said. The voice carried the wear of journeys, but not complaint. Etta stepped aside and motioned them in. Somebody drew a thin rug and a bowl, and Hadley offered a spare cloak without ceremony. The traveler unwrapped the parcel gently, as if whatever lay within needed to keep its order on the way into warmth. When the parcel opened, there was no show of treasure, merely a small worn satchel, a folded note, and, pressed between pages of the satchel's lining, a coin that had been marked not by shine, but by use. It was an old thing, edges soft under fingers, as if it had been turned over many times beneath pockets and palms. The coin looked, in the lantern light, a little like the shavings on the floor, rounded and honest, coloring the smallness of the room with the hint of a history. The innkeeper offered a bowl and a mat. The traveler accepted with a nod, and then, as if remembering caution, placed the satchel upon the hearthstone and did not open it further. The house, which had been busy with the honest indignities of necessary repair, received this new presence without drama. Bramble approached the satchel with the deliberate curiosity of a creature that understands what warmth might mean. He sniffed and satisfied himself before curling back on the innkeeper's feet. Supper became a quieter thing then, a modest, deliberate sharing. The travelers' hands, when they were given tea, were calloused but not rough. They spoke little. When Mrs. Arbuthnot gently prodded for a story, the traveler only smiled and offered an anecdote small and clean. Once, on a road between towns, they had found a child's mitten hanging from a signpost, patched with various scraps and tied with string. They had taken it down, mended it with what they had, carried it for a time in case its owner returned. Small acts, they implied, were how one kept the world repairable. The apprentices listened. Mira, who was already beginning to understand that repair was more than craft, watched the traveler's hands. Jory leaned forward as if he might learn something by aligning his breath with another's. The conversation moved like their stitching, purposeful, neat, the way talk can be the same as work if one shapes it. A wheel passed, distant and slow. The carriage's axle announced itself like a punctuation mark against the hush outside. The edge of routine frayed for a moment. Hadley rose and checked the shutters, feeling each hinge as if it might contain a complaint. "No danger," he said upon return. "Just the road complaining in its way." The stranger's parcel stayed on the hearth. The coin, pressed between pages, caught the lamplight like a small, patient thing. Night, as a shape, came to the inn as a lowering in pitch. Voices dropped to a murmur. Tasks were set out for the morning. The bath rail would be refitted at first light. The Norrin would hang again with its visible seam. Someone volunteered to sleep with a key on their person. Not because there was fear, but because stewardship in small villages had always been a matter of shared responsibility. Later, that person would be thanked not with fanfare, but with a quiet cup of tea. They made a small plan. Mira and Jory were to set a watch, rotating the two of them so they could practice the patience of small attentions. Asha would bring more moss and another length of twine in the morning. The elder would move her cane to the entry and sleep there so she could hear the house think. The traveler, whose satchel lay by the hearth, said little more than to accept the offered mat. They had come because roads demanded shelter, and because some houses, by their nature, took strangers in as part of their tally. Beyond the panes, the dragon, that old metaphor the innkeeper preferred, breathed in a wide arc of steam. The night took on a quality of listening. The house, the people, the small animal that had assumed duties of its own. The repairs done so far gathered like promises in the room. The torn Norin, now showing its intentional stitches, hung across the bath's doorway as a visible vow. The carpentry for the rail waited on the benches, a strip of oak glowing dull and patient under the lantern. They ate and shared small stories, and for a time the past was a sort of cushion under which they could rest. Mrs. Arbuthnot told of a threshold she remembered where the carpenter had carved a notch for a child's height. The notch, he explained, had been kept as a mark of the house's generosity. Etta made tea and listened, and in the spaces between talk and work, the house drew them tighter like a stitch drawing cloth to cloth. When the meal declined, the group arranged themselves into places of temporary sleep. The traveler was given the inner room with the thickest quilts. The apprentices took the tatami near the brazier, so they could be ready at a moment's call, and also practice the discipline of waking without jolting the house. Bramble threaded among them, and finally settled upon a mat that kept the heat of the hearth faintly to himself. Hadley made a low, practical joke about teaching Jory to wake without waking everyone else. Jory, not quite a man in his own right, took the admonition like a lesson for which he would later be grateful. The house, now partly mended and partly waiting, breathed and exhaled. Etta coiled herself in a chair by the hearth for a short while, listening to the soft catalogue of the repaired and the broken remaining. The Norin, dimly lit, showed its stitches like a pattern of small moons. The strip of oak lay on the bench, its grain waiting to be coaxed into place. Outside, snow feathered the path in more insistently, each flake a small, soft interruption. At some hour later, a faint sound pulled Hadley from the thin place between sleep and wakefulness. It was not a cry, nor an alarm. It was a texture, the scrape of iron on wood, gentle as if someone was testing a lock. He rose, slipping on his boots with the subdued, practiced efficiency of a man who has learned to move without making a household rise at each small necessity. He left the others where they lay and moved to the door. At the threshold he paused, hand on the frame, listening to the night. The inn held its lanterns close. The dragon's breath outside rose like steam. Hadley opened the door a fraction and looked out. The walkway showed only footprints pressed into snow and the soft, dim shape of the traveler's cloak. The satchel by the hearth, he saw in the spill of light, had been moved, not by him, not by anyone obvious, and now lay against the low bench where visitors tend to leave their things. He could have closed the door and called it sleep. But he remembered a carpenter's respect for small disturbances. A plank may settle of its own accord until it needs attention. It is better, he thought, to attend. He did not call the others immediately. He drew the lantern from its hook and took it with him, its flame small and careful as a coin kept in a wooden case. The light mapped the path ahead. It made the snow look like smoothed scales. He approached the hearth and saw the satchel with the coin peeking out. Next to it, a folded slip of paper had been placed, neat as a repair. Hadley felt, at that small sight, a familiar, quiet curiosity, the same that makes a craftsman read the grain before choosing where to cut. He tucked the lantern under his arm and opened the slip. The handwriting was compact and neat. It said nothing dramatic, only a few words. For the night, for the house. Beneath them, a name, one he did not recognize. He slid the paper into his pocket and turned the satchel with the lantern's light. Inside, beneath flannel and string, there were no treasures as such. A bit of soap, a pair of well-worn socks, a small folded map with routes penciled in along the margins. Tucked between the map's crease, almost as if it had been slipped there in haste and then left, was a thin scale. It was not a scale like a dragon scale in stories. It was the scale of a fish, perhaps, or something small and silvered that had once belonged to something larger. It caught the lantern and flashed with a wet, pearly gleam. Hadley held it up without sentiment. The thing was simply what it was, a small, persistent relic of a life that crossed water. He put it back in the satchel, closed the flap, and placed the parcel again by the hearth. He stood still for a long enough moment to feel the house breathe around him, to feel the steady shift of heat that comes from 100 small fires tended over seasons. Then he returned to the room where the apprentices slept and laid himself down again on the mat. He did not tell them about the scale. He would, he thought, wait until morning when things were less likely to be doomy misread. That night, the inn kept watch in its small practical ways. A single lantern stayed lit by the bath, its glow a line of coins. The Norrin fluttered a little once as if to show its new seam. Hadley dreamed briefly of planes and shavings, of oak that fit into its place with a soft, perfectly even gasp. The rest of the house slept as a hoard sleeps, with small treasures laid out for exchange, with the faint knowledge that all manner was attentive. There was a comfort in the not yet finished. The bath rail, partly planed and waiting, suggested the morning would have a purpose. The Norrin hung as a visible testament to mending. The stitches were a line to follow into tomorrow. The traveler slept, parcel close, breathing like someone who had come into harbor after a long night at sea. The apprentices napped in a way that suggested growth. Their shoulders had new weight, and yet their hands, no longer idle, were restless in their dreams, practicing stitches. At an hour when the sky was near its deepest blue, and the snow showed a silver that gave no hint of sunrise, the house shifted. The dragon's breath outside became a softer rhythm, the steam more diffuse, the air a truer cold. Somewhere in the street a cart's wheel turned, not in haste, but in the measured passage of a route kept. And in that soft hour, as the world drew nearer to the edge of waking, a sense of readiness gathered among those already awake. Hadley would soon wake the apprentices. The bath would be set to hot, the rail would be tested once more. The work was not an imposition, but a kind of benediction, an opportunity to make the house right again, to make the stitches bear witness to care. They did not yet know the small particulars of the morning, whether the oak would rise willingly, whether the grommets would hold. But they knew this. Repair was a slow conversation between materials and hands. Dawn would be the next sentence of that conversation, and they would begin it with the steady, practical attention they had given the night. The house, for its part, seemed to be waiting with ancient patience, its rooms like pockets of treasure ready to be sorted and refolded. Dawn came as if by habit rather than by accident. An uncomplicated light, pale and patient, that pooled first along the eaves and then traveled inward, tracing the low beams and the rounded shoulders of kettles. It found the inn in a state of small readiness. The brazier smoldered into a steady coal, the steam from the bathhouse threaded into the rafters in thinner, cooler breaths, and the lanterns, those coins of light, had been banked to soft sockets so that their flames might sleep without going fully out. Hadley rose before the apprentices, not because he wished to claim the triumph of early waking, but because wood waits for an angle and a hand that remembers how to coax it. He did not wake the house with a shout. He moved through it the way a plane moves across oak, with attention to the grain, with the steady pressure that asks nothing of the material but offers the chance to align. He set a small brazier near the bench in the workshop, struck a flint, and coaxed a flame the color of a small coin, and then took up the plank again. In the lantern's dim, the strip of oak changed from an object of potential into a thing with a history. Knots and a faint scar where the saw had nicked it seasons before. The end that would mate with the old rail showing the faintest asymmetry that only the patient eye could see. Mira and Jory stirred when Hadley moved, the sound of their waking like a second, smaller wave following his. They padded into the workshop with bare feet that remembered the warm tatami and the hearth's lull. Their bodies carried the residue of sleep, shoulders loose, eyes clarifying in the sober light. Hadley greeted them with a nod more than with words. There was easier teaching at dawn, the kind that is given by demonstration and by silence, and that waits for questions to rise from the apprentice rather than being dropped from the top. "Measure twice," Hadley said, voice low, as he set the rule along the rail and drew a pencil mark where the new piece would enter. "Mark the shoulder here. It'll catch if you lean it in too far." He held the rail as a man might hold a promise. The old wood smelled faintly of last summer's sun and of the residual oil they kept in a jar for a dozen small final touches. Jory leaned close, then further, angling his shoulder to make room for the plank's body. Mira took the plane in hand with the same reverence she had shown the waxed thread, and she set its blade to the board as if speaking a private instruction. The first shaving fell away in a thin curl that trembled between wood and air, catching light like a scale. The apprentices worked in measured succession. Jory cut the scarf joint under Hadley's eye. He hesitated at the point where the grain changed direction and was guided by a small touch on the wrist, a whisper of repositioning rather than a correction. Mira tested the surface, running a paper across it to feel for high spots the eye might miss. She then passed the plane once, twice, and the board sighed into evenness. Each movement was an essay in patience. A lean, a pull, the blade taking what it needed and leaving the rest. Outside, the snow had sunk softer into the lane, and the light had brightened enough to make the house's windows look like slats of pale coin laid into a dark cloth. The dragon's breath, the steam from the bathhouse, hung thinner now, its warmth scarcely holding against the morning air. It came inside in a neat thread, as Etta drew the Norrin aside and placed their repaired curtain on the rail to test its swing. The stitches showed plainly. They were neat, a row of small, deliberate notches that moved in a line like a simple script. Etta smiled at them as if at small handwriting. The bath was lit and readied for whoever chose to make use of its warmth. The traveler rose when the day asked. They moved slowly, wrapping themselves in a cloak that smelled faintly of distant peat and of lanolin. They thanked the household with the soft, succinct gratitude of someone who has accepted shelter as if it were an obligation the world occasionally offers in reprieve. The coin and the scale remained, quiet on the hearth, the satchel folded and closed. The traveler padded across the threshold with a brief bow and then waited by the door as if to ensure that the house was properly tended before they left the small relics behind. The apprentices performed small rituals, too. They swept shavings into neat piles so that none would be accidentally trodden into fabric. They set the plane aside and oiled its blade with a slow cloth, the oil darkening the metal to a soft sheen. Hadley fitted a small clamp and measured the rail for the final time. He showed them how to rasp the edge just enough so that the groove would accept the peg cleanly. He knocked out the old nail and prepared the joint with a mallet whose wood had been warmed by 1,000 measured taps. The mallet's head made a sound like a tiny knell when it struck the dowel. Precise. Satisfactory. At one point, when the board had been coaxed to shape and was ready to be offered up, Hadley stepped back and breathed out as if acknowledging a deed well begun. He called both apprentices close and let each in turn seat the rail within the old framework. Jory held the end while Mira steadied the opposite shoulder. Hadley tapped the joint with the mallet, and then, with a hand as firm as a benediction, set the peg into the hole. The final fit was subtle. A small give, a faint compression of sound, the kind that suggests two old things are content to sit with one another. The rail was home. The Norn's rod was set, the curtain hung, and the brass grommets, Asha's careful offering, sat flush and ready. Asha had come early with more moss, having cut a fresh swathe from behind her greenhouse. She tucked moss into the jamb where the rail met the post, cushioning the joint so that the curtain would not complain at the slightest movement. She pressed the moss with an instinctive, soft hand that seemed to know exactly how much pressure would be enough and no more. The Norn swung and settled into its place like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Etta stood back and considered the room as if reading a score. The visible stitches on the curtain were a line that the eye could follow. The rail's seam created a small shadow that read like a bow. She threaded a needle and, by way of a close, made 2 or 3 decorative stitches along the Norn's lower edge. Not to hide the repair, but to mark it, to make it a known and deliberate addition. "We leave them honest," she said later, to no one and to all, as the apprentices wrapped the last of the rope around a spare coupling. So the house remembers who made it right. Breakfast was a table of small, deliberate portions. They ate with the easy silence of people who had been up with their hands. Soup warmed the chest, and bread offered a small, plain joy. The traveler tucked the satchel under their arm as if to take the scale with them, but Hadley, noticing the small movement, said nothing. Instead, Mira pressed a wrapped parcel into the traveler's hand, some warmed bread and a small wedge of cheese. And Jory looked up with a shy, newly practiced courtesy that made those older in the room smile. The traveler accepted the gifts, and, in return, slipped a small folded note into Etta's palm before they left. It was a careful exchange. The note had neat, businesslike handwriting. For the night, for the hands that keep, for the coin of warmth. Beneath it, a single, barely necessary sentence. May the house always have room. Nothing grand, nothing ornate. The traveler nodded once, a bow with the small gravity of someone who had accepted the economy of a kind world. They left a folded coin, wrapped in paper, and placed beneath the note, which Etta took and set on a small saucer beside the hearth. She did not count it aloud. She gave the traveler the short good wishes that fit a road and a house and watched them fade into the morning, cloak heavy with damp, a small figure receding into the pale street. When the door closed, the inn's interior offered a second silence. The attentive quiet that follows a departure and that sets the table for the day's work. The apprentices returned to their tasks, hands more confident now for the night's labor. Hadley set to the final smoothing of the rail's edge. He taught them a small trick, to hold the chisel at a particular slant then to tap with the mallet in a rhythm that the wood recognizes. He whispered that patience, like a plane, must be held with a steady hand lest it cut more than necessary. They laughed, a small, present sound, the laughter of people who have just learned to do something useful and like the result. The mending did not end with the rail. There were smaller, intimate items that the group took to with equal ardor. Etta asked Mira to mend a little tear in a favorite apron. The elder produced a lampshade that had lost its binding and suggested a reed from Asha's stock might be useful. They recovered a small tray with washi, smoothing its surface until the pattern matched the tray's worn use. Each tiny object received the same visible respect as the Norin. Stitching that was not hidden but celebrated. A new edge that would be allowed to show as evidence of care. Mrs. Arbuthnot, having settled her cane at the inner alcove, took it upon herself to perform one of the household's ceremonial acts. She produced a small knife, its handle worn smooth by years, and with a careful eye she carved a notch on the inside of the door frame that marked the apprentice's heights. "For remembering," she said, voice thin but steady. "So, each time you pass that threshold, you'll know how much you have grown." She traced the mark with a finger, then sat back and watched as Mira and Jory measured themselves against it, half incredulous, half admiring. The gesture was small, and yet it hung in the air like a promise. Time bent around these occupations and drew them into the kitchen for a late, leisurely lunch. Conversation reasserted itself in soft, comfortable loops. The elder told, in a manner that never overstayed its welcome, a story about a threshold in a town 2 villages over, where a carpenter once carved a tiny dragon into the sill, to remind people to step carefully. The dragon's eye was a knot of wood that people kissed for luck on moving day. Hadley mimicked the motion, carving a quick, private notch in the edge of a spare beam, a small, good-humored echo of the old tale. They performed the small finishing rituals that make a repaired object part of daily life. Etta went about adjusting lanterns, moving them half an inch along their brackets so the pooled light would now fall differently. She closed a window that had been left slightly open to temper a draft. She set a saucer of iron filings beneath a hinge to catch the small rust that might come later. It was not an obsessive caution, but a careful stewardship that showed their sense of belonging to the house's life. In the afternoon, Hadley took a moment to teach the apprentices the last part of the rail's making, the groove for the peg, and the chamfer that would make it slide in without catching. He showed Jory how to shave the edge so that the peg would sit flush and not split the old wood, and he let Mira practice on a spare piece until her hands remembered the angle. Each time a shaving came off, Hadley would pick it up and set it aside, as if saving it in case the inn ever needed to know the precise hue of a particular morning. There was a sense, as the day wore, of the house settling into a new shape. The Norin's visible seam became less an improvised repair and more a mark of identity. Guests who came in the late afternoon, a neighbor retrieving a forgotten umbrella, a child accompanied by a parent, noticed the curtain and commented, as people tend to do, that it had been mended well. The elder, pleased at this, offered the apprentices a small lesson in the ethics of mending that had nothing to do with tools. "When you let someone see your mends," she said, voice soft as a folded letter, "you allow them to read you as someone who has kept going." That evening, as a way of marking the day's labor, and as an informal ceremonial close, they gathered for soup again. This time the traveler had already gone, their tracks leading away across the lane, a fading proof of passage. The satchel remained by the hearth, now quiet and still. Etta had placed the coin upon a small plate, and set the coin beside a jar where small tokens were gathered. Buttons, a child's marble, a copper washer. Things that spoke of exchange and of the ordinary economy of kindness. She did not boast the gift. She let it be a part of the house's quiet account. When the meal was done, Hadley proposed a small lesson for that evening, to bind a small emblem for the apprentices. He took a brass washer and a tiny length of waxed thread, and, in a deliberate, private way, looped the thread through and tied a knot whose form was not decorative, but instructive. "There are hands now," he said, looking at Mira and Jory, "and there will be a day when they'll have to trust what they have made. Keep such a thing in your pocket. Touch it when you need to be reminded that small acts add up." The apprentices accepted theirs with the solemnity of those who had earned something more meaningful than a trinket. The elder, sitting as she often did with a small measure of amusement, produced a proverb in that measured cadence she favored. "A house with visible stitches will teach the world to mend." It was not new, but it landed with satisfying weight. Etta nodded, pressing her palms together in a small, private gesture of thanks to everyone who had come and given labor. The night drew near the end of its arc, and they performed the habitual tasks of closing. Lanterns were banked, and then one kept for the bath. The Norrin swung in a pattern set by its new weight. The rail fit solid, and had no complaint when the curtain was drawn and released. The satchel was still here. Hadley picked it up and, on impulse rather than ceremony, slipped the thin scale into his pocket. He told no one. He did not see it as a sign. He saw it simply as a small thing that had been present in the house and that might, by and by, be placed with other minute objects that mark a household's history. The travelers and neighbors departed into a clear night that smelled faintly of frozen apples and of peat. The apprentices slept with their brass washers under their pillows like talismans. Mrs. Arbuthnot went to her alcove and read, as the lamp made a patient pool of light, a short page from a book about the history of bridges in quiet valleys. Asha went home with a small packet of leftover moss and a promise to bring more reed in the week. Bramble curled, as always, at the hearth and made a small sound that was both purr and contented admonition. Before they turned in for the night, Etta moved through the rooms and did the small inventory of a woman who thinks of upkeep as care of living things. She straightened a mat at the entrance, smoothed a fold in a futon, and tucked a kettle closer to the brazier, so an early hand would not have to reach too far. She paused at the hearth where the coin sat, and picked up the note the traveler had left. She read the simple words once more. "May the house always have room." She folded the note carefully, and, without ceremony, slid it into the inside of a small cupboard used for keeping things that required both privacy and memory. Then she stood by the Norrin and took the thin scale that Hadley had pocketed, not as an act of superstition, but as a selection of objects for the inn's small altar of ordinary things. She placed it on a shallow bowl along with a thin shaving of oak and a bright brass grommet. It sat between them like a quiet witness, a thing of the road and the water, a fragment that suggested more journeys than it declared. Etta did not attribute to it any greater power than that it made the house's collection more honest. It was now another item in the inn's hoard of small, exact objects. A house that slept among coins of light, with the occasional shard of sea and road on its shelves. The final night watch was uneventful and exacting in the best way. The house hummed with the sounds of habitation. A cup set down, the slow creak of a hinge, the soft clearing of the elder's throat as she settled into sleep. The apprentices lay awake for a time, minds turning over the day's new competencies. Eventually, their breathing aligned with the house's breath, a long, even rhythm. The dragon's image hovered, as it always had for Etta, not as a literal creature, but as the notion of an old presence that keeps its treasure with slow patience. The inn did not pretend to be a dragon's cave. It preferred to be a repository of the human kind. Things repaired, stories held, and shelter given. Morning opened like a second small surprise. Light softened through washi. The air tasted fresh as if swept by a sea breeze. Hadley rose and was greeted by the faintest smell of tea, which Etta had left for him on the bench. The apprentices, eager now rather than merely obedient, appeared in the workshop almost before he had had a chance to stretch his hand. They moved with that particular lightness that comes when one knows a method will be practiced again and perfected. The final task remained: the patching of a small threshold board that had developed a slight concavity under years of foot. It was the sort of job that looks small on a ledger, but tells its weight when a child trips on a raised lip or when a cup is jostled to the floor. Hadley chose a narrow strip from his pile, measured the recess, and then taught Mira and Jory the technique of the feathered edge. Plane the new piece so that it meets the old, not in a blunt step, but in a gradual, honest merge. The shaving curls fell like tiny scales and were gathered in a palm, each one a miniature proof of the day's gentle work. They set the strip into place with quiet ceremony. The apprentices steadied the bench while Hadley drove the final pegs. The mallet did its measured work. The peg sank with a small, pliant sound as if the wood exhaled. Mira sanded the edge and then rubbed linseed oil into the joint until the seam's color settled, the finish dulling into a tone that made the repaired place appear as if it had always been so. They stepped back and listened for the small sound of feet crossing the threshold. The board answered with a modest, correct tone. There was a communal, almost reverent satisfaction. The house spoke right again. They hung the norin so the new stitches caught the light and made a little line like a string of pale coins. Etta took a step back and, with a gesture that might be called a benediction if one insisted on religious language, she ran her hand along the rail. "It keeps," she said simply. "That's enough." The traveler, who had intended to leave earlier, returned for a moment as if to check whether the house had taken their gift properly. They stood in the doorway, eyes on the norin, and then looked at the group arrayed around the rail. For a moment there was a forgetfulness in their face, a lapse into the simplicity of being a guest. And then, without flourish, they drew a small folded note from their pocket and left it on the hearth. This new note was shorter than the first and read in handwriting grown slightly crisper with rest. For the house. Keep a place for those who carry less than stories. Etta tucked the note into the cupboard beside the first, and then reached for the coin the traveler had left earlier. She opened her palm, set the coin upon it, and considered the way the metal looked in the morning light. Not bright as if newly minted, but soft around the edges as if turned often in people's hands. She offered it to the group in a simple way. "For the kettle," she suggested. "For the small things that make this place run." The elder, perceiving the opportunity for instruction, suggested something else. "Let some of it go to the apprentices' fund," she said, voice as limpid as the bowl they drank from. Small tools, a spare spool of thread, things that let them practice without asking for help every time. She tapped the coin without possessiveness, more as a punctuation. Mira and Jory exchanged a look that was equal parts gratitude and embarrassment. They accepted the elder's suggestion with polite humility. There was no great accounting done. Etta broke the day's commons into small parts, some for the kettle, some folded and kept back as the elder advised, and a little bit placed among the inn's small relics to remember that generosity travels both ways. It was an economy not of ledger, but of gestures. Before the traveler left for real, for the road that had called them onward, they pinned the small scale that had caused such quiet curiosity to a scrap of card, and offered it to Etta. "It will do better here," they said. "A house is a truer keeper than my satchel." Etta accepted the offering with both hands, smoothing the paper flat before tucking the card into the little display bowl with the shaving and the grommet. The scale sat there like a pale coin among other coins, not demanded, not bartered, simply kept. They walked away without fanfare. Their footprints made a thin pattern in the lane. The day received them like any other traveler. The inn, in its turn, continued its practice of receiving and returning, of being a place where small acts of attention accumulate into something like safety. The afternoon became a time for small, neat closures. The apprentices were given, by Hadley, a small rite of passage. Each was permitted to sign the underside of the new rail with a narrow knife, a private mark that would not be seen by the casual passer-by, but which would remain as a modest signature of their work. They did so with hands that trembled only briefly and then settled. The elder recorded, in a small ledger, kept for the inn's slow history, a single line noting the day's mending and the names of those who had tended it. She did not elaborate. She need not. The ledger's ink would be read in years to come as a map of practical kindness. As evening slid into place, they performed the last domestic tasks. Lanterns were adjusted so that the Norn would gleam just enough to show its stitches without being a lamp itself. Tea was poured and divided into small cups. The apprentices were given their small brass washers in a moment that was more solemn than any crowd's applause. Hadley took them each by the shoulder and told them, not in a lesson, but in a soft, personal address, that the token was not to remind them they had learned something swift or simple, but that they had undertaken the patience of care. "You'll be poor at it sometimes," he said, "and you'll make better mends the more you know what to save." The elder offered a proverb of parting: "Where stitch shows, love stays." It was said with a private amusement and a public gravity that made everyone around the table smile. The innkeeper, Etta, watched those who had come, and those who had gathered their small gifts, and then settled into a chair near the hearth. Bramble wound around her feet like a practiced ribbon. She put her hand over his fur and felt the warm, steady drum of life beneath. Before the last light faded, Etta rose and opened the small cupboard where she had placed the traveler's notes and the coin. She retrieved the first note and read it again in the gathering dusk. Then, with a decision that felt like a ritual rather than an act of organization, she folded the notes and tucked them into the binding of an old book kept on a shelf reserved for things the inn wanted to remember. She placed the coin in the small jar above the stove, not for accounting's sake, but as a token of exchange that would feed the kettle in other afternoons when guests came at odd hours and needed warmth. There was a hush that followed the day's busyness, a lowering of the room's pitch that felt like the closing of a long, careful hand. Hadley performed a last circuit, checking the joints of the door and the handle of the kettle, ensuring that things were set to require only ordinary attention overnight. Mira and Jory sat quietly, hands folded in their laps, their faces clean of dust but glowing with the day's labor. The elder's breathing slowed into a steady rhythm. Asha came by the gate for a moment to gather a leftover scrap of moss for her greenhouse, and to say, with a neighbor's brevity, that she would come with more reed next week. When the house finally accepted its night, It did so as if taking a breath that had been rehearsed for centuries. Lanterns were banked to cozy, thin flames. The Norrens' visible seam stood like a line of small moons. The rail settled into silence, content. The dragon's breath, in the soft way the innkeeper understood, spread as steam in the rafters, and then dissolved with a faint sigh. The house did not claim to be a dragon's hoard in the literal sense. Instead, it was a place where treasures were practical. Thread, timber, kindness, the occasional coin left by a passing stranger. These were the true scales and the quiet gold. Etta, before she finally lay down, walked the rooms with a little practice she had learned through the years. She opened one window a sliver to let the night's cold refresh the air, and then closed it after a beat. She checked each futon and smoothed the coverlets. Then she sat by the hearth, breathing in the smell of hot metal and washed linen, and let her hands rest in her lap. She thought about the day's stitches and shavings, about the way the apprentice's hands had learned to follow the grain, and about the brief, clean gratitude of the traveler. She felt, with that domestic certainty that endures beneath the surface of things, that houses are the slow record of people's small choices. She rose to the doorway and looked out at the lane. Snow shone with borrowed light. The house glowed behind her like a small hoard lit by deliberate lamps. She closed the door gently, not to keep out the world, but to preserve the house's particular shape of attention. Then she sat and allowed herself a few moments of slow breathing, mindful as any craftsman of the need to bring one's own body into the same measured rhythm as the things one tends. If you are listening now and your eyes are heavy from the day, let this be a small invitation. Sit with your back supported and allow your shoulders to relax. Breathe in slowly, through the nose, as if drawing in the thin warmth that flows beneath a Norren. Hold for a moment, just enough to feel the support of the breath, and then let it go, as if releasing a plane's shaving into a bowl. Do this twice more. In, steady, out, soft. Imagine, for a heartbeat, a coin of light settling on the edge of your thoughts, and then sinking into the hearth of what keeps you safe. The inn's final image that night was simple. The Norren swinging a little, the rail silent and true, the lanterns small and patient. The elder hummed a line of a tune her mother once sang. Hadley and the apprentices slept with tools at the ready, in a way that suggested confidence rather than vigilance. The traveler's scale gleamed faintly in its bowl. A small, honest object who had traveled and ended up, as many such things do, in the keeping of a house that understands how to hold them. In the morning, as always, there would be new chores and new kindnesses to offer. The apprentices would practice their planes. The elder would measure new notches for younger children. Asha would tend her garden that fed everyone with small leaves and roots. The inn would return to its slow commerce, of tea and room, of repairs and visible stitches. And the dragon would keep breathing, softly, as any old thing is permitted to do when its presence is kind rather than ominous. The house would remain, in its modest, enduring way, a hoard of gentle things. Scales of light, the dull weight of brass, the thin, honest sheen of a shaving. And if you find, upon your own threshold, a small tear in a curtain or a rail that hitches so you stub your toe against the day, remember the household that spent an evening making seams honest and visible. You might gather thread and plane, or you might sit and call a neighbor, or you might simply take a moment to mind how the light falls across what you keep. Any such small attention is a stitch in the great fabric of ordinary care. If this quiet evening suits you, consider staying for more like it. A gentle follow helps us hold more nights in this tone of attentive presence. Now, in your own rhythm, breathe again. In to the count that suits you. Out, letting the shoulders loosen. Picture, if you will, a scale of light, thin as paper, catching the edge of your own small treasure. A worn coin, a saved note, a child's drawing. And let it rest on the inner shelf where only you may find it. When you are ready, open your eyes slowly. Carry with you the image of the inn, a house that sleeps in a dragon's hoard of gentle things, kept by hands that mend visibly and live well. May your thresholds be kind, and may you always have room enough to offer shelter and receive it in turn.